Good morning. And it's possible that the title of this talk could be Thinking That Quiets Thinking. So the use of thinking to help the mind become quieter. And thinking. There's a story of a expert, skilled painter who painted a tiger. Was busy painting it close up. At some point stepped back to look at the work and was so frightened, it was so realistic that ran away. Recently, there's a story of Gil needing to plan ahead on for something, and something a little bit dangerous, I guess. And so kind of thinking out the scenarios that needed to be planned for. And then at some point got pulled into a hypothetical scenario around this kind of danger. And got pulled into it like a little fantasy, as opposed to just, methodically planning ahead. I wasn't in there very long, but after a minute or so I kind of recognized that I'd been pulled into this fantasy of danger. But what was interesting was not that I was caught up in the fantasy, but what was interesting was it wasn't just an image, it wasn't just words, that there was a little bit of trepidation involved because of this wonderfully realistic tiger I'd painted in my mind, kind of. And I could feel that it affected my body. I felt a little bit of fear and tightness and a little bit something. A little bit more vulnerable, just for like 1 minute little thing. It wasn't very dramatic. And so I caught it, and I kind of realized I'd gone off the planning mode and what I needed to take care of, and got lost in a little fantasy. So I changed gears. That was easy enough. But it made me reflect on how not everyone can catch themselves so early, and I wasn't able to when I was younger. And the idea of just being lost in these thoughts or caught up in these kinds of ideas chronically. For some people, the past and the future, for some people, fantasies about the past or the future, ideas, are more real than the present. They have greater, and the reason I think for that is that the way in which we can internalize it, our fantasies or images, our emotions, all this stuff gets our expectations, our hopes, our sense of self. All these things can kind of come up together as a complex. Sometimes more so with fantasy or imagination or being in our thoughts than they can sometimes in regular life. And if those kinds of thoughts are not, to use a word of the Buddha's, not beautiful thoughts, but harmful thoughts, then they harm us. And so the chronic rumination, they say, is a leading cause for depression, for example. And if those ruminations are tinged or filled with fear, then it's no wonder that people are chronically anxious because of these kinds of thoughts that are kind of feeding us or conditioning us or affecting us. And so one of the important aspects of mindfulness practice is to get wise about thinking. And not only wise, but also intelligent about it. It took me a long time. I've been doing this practice since I was 20. And when I started it, no one said this explicitly, but I kind of got the message that you weren't supposed to use your intelligence. You were just supposed to show up and be present. And in fact, showing up and be present was quite powerful for me. So it worked, and it developed. I did a lot of meditation, and it was really great. But at some point, it occurred to me, wait a minute. Here we're trying to be present for everything, allow for everything, accept everything in a certain way. But I've checked my intelligence at the door. Why not include that as part of it? Why not use a certain degree of thinking, of understanding, of exploration to help with the meditation practice? Now it's easy to, when we hear use your intelligence in meditation, to drift off and just think even more and spin out even more. But the art of this is to use your thinking, use your intelligence for the purposes of quieting the mind. Not numbing it, but quieting the mind so it's sharper, clearer, and you can see what's happening in the present moment in a very clear, present, engaged way, without the filter of a lot of thoughts, projections, expectations, hopes, all these things we add on top of them. So you have that as kind of like the guide. Don't just use your intelligence to be an engineer of meditation and think more and more. Use it to say what would be helpful for you, so that you're more able to be disentangled from your experience. How do you be present so you're not so caught and lost in your thoughts, and really here and present? How do you use thinking to quiet your thinking? How do you use thinking so thinking doesn't obscure the present moment for you? So that's a little bit the task of this talk, is to try to talk about that. So I think it's helpful to understand that there are many forms of thinking. And without appreciating all the different types of thinking there are, I think sometimes meditation instructions can be understood too simplistically. And the most simplistic and maybe harmful way of understanding it is you're not supposed to think in meditation, that somehow thinking is wrong or bad. And I've gotten that message even from some of my teachers. I had one teacher who, I had a question about something or other, and I started my question with the phrase, "What do you think?" It was innocent enough. What do you think about it? And I don't think I finished the rest of the sentence. The teacher shot back and said, "I try not to think." And, oh, okay. So that was kind of like the end of the conversation. And now it's a story in a Dharma talk. But I think there was some wisdom to what the teacher was saying, and I think also it can give the wrong message, that you're not supposed to think at all. And there are certain kinds of thinking which are not helpful for meditation. And to be able to recognize that kind of thinking and then be wise about how to engage it or free yourself from it is good. And then there's certain kinds of thinking which is helpful. And to be able to recognize how it's helpful and to use what's helpful for meditation is a good thing. So, to have this like one policy about thoughts is not very helpful. I think of thinking as many species of thoughts. And so we have to kind of differentiate the different species. So, thinking. The one that is, I think, and I like to think of thoughts as having different intensities, different amount of energy and agitation as part of them. And so the most kind of energetic, or the most coarsest, the most agitating, tend to be the ones that are called discursive thinking. And that's where we're having a discourse with someone. Either it's a monologue, and you're holding forth, or you're having a dialogue with something, and you're sort of filling in both sides of the conversation, maybe. And which is not very fair for the other person. But you're going back and forth, and you're having a conversation, or you're explaining something, or you're telling yourself a story. Like when I got caught in my little dangerous story, I was telling myself a story, spinning a tale that was going on and on for a little bit. And so this usually has nothing to do with what's happening in the present moment. Most often it has to do maybe with the past, with the future, or something which is not present here and now. And it could even be fantasy. It's not even anywhere in the world. It's just, a fantasy. And that tends to use a lot of the imagination, imaginary conversation, imaginary people who are listening to us, imaginary scenarios of what goes on and what's being talked about. And it can be quite captivating. It can be quite interesting and involved. And one of the reasons why these things can be very interesting is sometimes they're very entertaining. And sometimes what we fantasize is more entertaining than the present moment, so might as well go off and think. Another reason why they're quite captivating is that what we're thinking about is consequential. Like we fantasize or envision stories and ideas about things that are dangerous. And some people specialize in that. A lot of people who spend a lot of time planning are often planning around something that's connected to the world of fear and anxiety and worried about what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day. And so, our survival's at stake, and so we get pulled in and sucked into those fantasies because it seems so consequential. Also, one of the reasons we get sucked into them is that we're often the primary character in the discourse. Somehow it reflects on us. If we're having a conversation with someone, I've been involved in my mind rehearsing conversations, rehearsing ones I'm going to have in order to make a good impression or to be right. To rehearse with conversations I had in order to be right better. I should have said that, there have been times in my life, unfortunately, when I was trying to think of the right cutting word to kind of get back at someone. If I had only said that. I'm a character. It's my kind of ego, my idea of how I want to be seen, and how I want to present myself, how I was seen, how I was hurt, how I can be better, how I can be improved. I'm kind of like, a major character in it, and for better or for worse, that's very attractive to the mind because, we're like an interesting person for ourselves, one way or the other. And so that's the glue that keeps us there. But to be caught up in discursive thought is not very helpful for the quieting, the calming, the stilling of the mind. It's not so helpful to be able to see clearly what's going on. And something I've said often is that I noticed at some point in my life that when I had a grudge with someone, I was quite capable of, again, thinking about the grudge, thinking about what I'm going to say, thinking about who that person is. And I was operating with assumptions that were not very accurate. I had a kind of caricature of the person in my mind. The person had become kind of a caricature, and I was reacting and talking to them as if they were that caricature. And so I learned at some point that I did not have a very good track record of viewing a person realistically whom I had a grudge with. So I have now the practice, within reason, if it's not too difficult, to go find the person and be in the presence of the person. Because then my caricature kind of breaks up. And especially if I can engage in a conversation with a person, and especially even more so, if I could be a little bit kind to the person, give them, I don't know if the benefit of the doubt's the right word, expression, but just, treat them decently with some kind, how are you and what's happening with you or something. And it helps me to do that because it breaks me out of the mold of seeing the person through the filter of a caricature or my grudge or something. And then if there's a valid grudge that needs to be talked about, then I talk about it with the person. Because as long as I'm talking to the person about it only in my fantasy, it's really not realistic. It's kind of a waste of time, actually. And so to learn, this isn't so useful, not helpful. It doesn't help me to see clear in the situation. And so then to learn how to step out of that, to wake up from it. Now certainly, some people who have practiced mindfulness enough to a clear mindful recognition that what we're doing, that's what's happening, is enough to kind of break the spell. That's what's happening. It's kind of like we wake up. Some people have woken up from the spell of their fantasy. Oh, wait a minute. Here I am, and I was thinking about something. So to be mindful sometimes is enough. But sometimes that's not enough. Or sometimes there's other options of what to do. Anyway, so there's this, very coarse, this what I call discursive thinking, with the discourse and all that. A more subtle kind of thinking is to be thinking about what's happening in the present moment. I don't know if subtle is the right word, but you're connected to the present moment. It's here and now. And so the thoughts are much simpler. They're not involved fantasies, ideas. They're actually recognizing what's happening here and now. Like yesterday I was teaching here, And I was thinking some of the lights were on and some of the lights were not on. And so I was wondering, should I turn the other set of lights on? Maybe it's nice to have it a little bit dark. We're meditating for the day. What's the right way the light should be? So, I was having thoughts like that, it stretched out over the day. It wasn't as fast as I gave it to you now, but it was like, what should I do? How should we be here? And with the lights. And they didn't have a lot of power to those thoughts. They didn't have a lot of me in those thoughts. I wasn't thinking about, I hope people see me as the best light turner on. So it was relatively settled and calm. There wasn't a lot of agitation in it. I was just having these simple thoughts of what was going on here. And then there can be even simpler thoughts that are quieter, which are simple recognition thoughts of what's actually happening, with no concern or thoughts about what's supposed to happen, what can happen. And so I can sit here and feel that as I'm sitting here, my hands are warm, my hands are cool. I can sit here and feel that my breath is a little bit tight. And as I do that, there's a thought, the hand's warm, the hand's cool, it's tight in there. So I can sit here and have a thought, I'm spending a lot of time in fantasy. This is not useful. Those thoughts that say, this is not useful when I'm trying to meditate, to have thoughts about fantasy, is actually a wise thought. It's actually part of the solution to being caught up in fantasy. If you try to bat away every thought that you have and don't allow yourself that thought, then you don't benefit from the wisdom of that thought. So you say, this, being alone in fantasy is not so useful here. I wonder if there's something more useful to think about. And then you get pulled into the fantasy again, even before you answer the question. And then after a while, you wake up and say, wait a minute, I'm caught up again. And that happens a few times. And you say, I need to do something different here. I can't even figure out what to do. Why don't I create a different fantasy? Why don't I fight fire with fire? Why don't I do an imagination? Use my imagination, come up with a different scenario that engages my mind and that connects me to the meditation I'm doing. Let me imagine, I want to stay focused on my breath. Let's imagine that I'm coming up against my last breath before I die. And in 2 or 3 breaths from now, I'm going to fantasize that I'm laying on my deathbed, and this is going to be my very last breath. How do I want to be with that breath? Well, that fantasy might, why do I want to waste my time having a fantasy about, some abstract thing, crazy thing? This is actually important, this meditation. It's an existentially important issue. We're up against, the issues of life and death when we meditate. That's really what we're trying to address in meditation. How to find a deep sense of peace that sustains us even in the moments of dying. And the last breath, though, I better be there for that. Somehow that maybe galvanizes us. Okay, wow, I better be here now. It's kind of like a friend of mine who used to sleep a lot in meditation, and he was in Thailand, and his teacher told him to go meditate on the wall on the edge of the well, facing the well. That galvanized him, and he wasn't going to sleep anymore. So, I don't know if you like that fantasy about, this is my last breath. But that, it's using a fantasy to help you show up, collect yourself, okay, and be here. Suddenly it got your attention, my death, Or that fantasy about, your last breath might just really spin you out. So you have to use your intelligence to know that didn't work, or I know better than that. Let's do something simpler. Maybe simply, let me just imagine, say you're meditating at IMC. Let me imagine that I'm meditating at IMC. You are meditating at IMC, but imagine it. Imagine the room, the high ceiling, the big window. Imagine yourself in remember what color cushion or chair you're sitting on. Just start using your imagination to imagine what's actually happening with your eyes closed. it's not exactly meditation, but it's begin gathering your attention, drawing you in to be here. So to use your imagination to overcome being lost in imagination. Is there some ways you can use your imagination to connect here? I've used imagination, I've talked about this recently, I've used my imagination. Sometimes I use my imagination around the breathing. I love water, and I love waves. And sometimes I've imagined that my in-breath and out-breath are the waves going up and down. And so I kind of imagine I'm kind of floating on the waves of the rising and passing of my in-breaths. And it's an imagination to do that. However, it's sometimes a better thing to do in meditation than the alternative that's happening, if I'm kind of spinning off a lot. And so then I'll do that imagination, and it feels very nice. And then I'm connected to the rhythm of my breathing. It's flowing along, moving along nicely. And then at some point, so it gathered me in. I'm getting interested. It's nice, and it works as a counter force to the mind that wants to spin off, with something that's, for me, not more interesting, but is interesting, and hopefully more interesting than the fantasy that was spinning me out. So then I use to be there, to be present. Then at some point, I know what I'm doing. That's part of the intelligent usage of this. I know what I'm doing. I'm doing it strategically. And so I'm going to do it to help me calm the mind, quiet the mind, get it connected to the present moment. So I watch as I'm doing this, I'm using this fantasy, isn't in fact supporting me to let the thinking mind quiet down, to become calmer? Or is there a way that I could use that fantasy to calm my mind? Maybe make it slower or calmer. A calm fantasy. And then there's the simple recognition of what's happening here. And so I recognized yesterday the lights were on and off. I recognized that my hand is hot and cold. I recognize my breathing is tight or loose. And there's a little thought to me that says that. How I tell myself, explain to myself what is happening with my thoughts, can be done at different mental intensities and speeds. If I can do it kind of fast, I can be in a hurry, kind of, or I could slow it down. Or I could speak in a normal thinking voice, or I could use a whispering thinking voice. You can adjust the tone, the quality, the intensity, the loudness of how you're thinking if you think in words. If you think in images, maybe you can change some of the images so they're maybe a little bit more diffuse or a little bit more quiet or less in them or something. But to make an adjustment, and one of the adjustments I like to give an example, lately I like similes sometimes. Talk to yourself like you would talk to the librarian in a very quiet library. Lean over the desk and say, I'm looking for my breath. Where's my breath? Where's my breath? There's an in-breath. There's an out-breath. Oh, look at that. And the idea is to kind of just recognize, there's a sound, there's a thought. At some point, when the mind is fairly quiet and still, that's a point where it can be really powerful to recognize a new thought that's arising, a thought that's not part of the practice, and recognize it and say to yourself, it's just a thought. It's just a thought. To say that with a fantasy is not quite so accurate, because the fantasy can create all these emotional feelings inside and all that, and it's more than just a thought. That's why they're so dangerous. But at some point you say, just a thought. It can pop the bubble or the authority of a simple thought. So for example, I'm sitting here meditating, and I recognize my breathing is tight. The tight feels chest, and it's kind of held in as I breathe. And every time I inhale, I feel a push up against where it's a little bit tight and held. And then I have this thought that in New Age California, that's a bad breath. It's supposed to be relaxed and open and spacious, and last thing you should do is admit it to everyone. And so that thought comes up, silly thought like that, and I say, that's just a thought. I don't give it any authority. I don't invest it in anything. Just a thought. If I don't say just a thought, I might kind of lean into it, or I might kind of believe it and wonder, or something kind of caught in it a little bit. But so when the mind is quiet enough and a new thought arises, sometimes you see it, the thought that says that's just a thought can pop the bubble and keep us from getting caught up in it. Then at some point, as we get settled down in meditation, calmer and more focused, and we're able to kind of cruise in the present moment. We're able to kind of ride in the present moment. We're staying in the present. We're in the groove of the present moment. At that point, thinking becomes more and more an adjunct to the practice than something that's more centrally supporting us. So, for example, an adjunct thought would be, as you're kind of staying with your breathing, you might, just to help you stay there and feel the breath, be in the groove of just sensing and feeling the in-breath and out-breath in the body, is you have the very simple thought, breathing in when you're breathing in, breathing out when you're breathing out. It's like having a little coach on the side that's cheering you on. Like, stay there, it's okay, it's okay. Stay with the in, feel it. Stay in the groove, stay in the present moment with the breath. And sometimes having a very light nudge like that, using a little word like in-breath, out-breath, can help you stay. And that's especially helpful if you're kind of there and you find yourself slipping off all the time. Slipping off, you're going to thought. Okay, I keep slipping off so much into thinking. Let me use a thought to help me stay in the groove, stay in the present moment. And so we use what's in mindfulness we call mental notes. So just noting what's happening in the present moment. Sound, hearing, an itching, breath, breathing, whatever it might be, a thought, thinking. And it isn't so much that the word is so important for it in and of itself. It's a way of using a thought to keep us in the groove of the present. Stay right here, as opposed to letting thinking letting thinking carry us away. So as the mind gets more settled, sometimes we can use that kind of one-word thought to stay here. Occasionally, I've actually said something like to myself, Gil, stay here, stay. Come on, you can stay right here. Because I'm kind of there in the present moment, kind of riding my breath, riding those waves, and I don't feel completely settled yet, and so I need a little stay. It's okay, Gil. Stay. You can do it. And that, at certain points, that way of thinking supports me, keeps me going, keeps me involved. Sometimes I have little thoughts of experimentation, what I should do. So, for example, I might have the thought that, Gil, your mind is drifting off a lot. And I say, what's going on here? Let me take a look at this, what's happening as the mind drifts off a lot. And I see that actually I'm planning a lot, and the planning is being fueled by anxiety. So I have the thought, Gil, there's anxiety. What would happen now if you brought your attention to the anxiety? Where is that anxiety? So it's a little thought, where's that anxiety? And so that's where it is. It's in my chest. How does it feel? Oh, it feels like agitation. What would happen if I just held my attention there? And so I hold my attention there. So there's very, very subtle thoughts that go on that are kind of pointing us and saying, oh, this is where you can pay attention. This is what you can do. Or if I'm just with the breathing, I might have the thought that this is good. I'm kind of with my breath. It's nice. But, I'd like to be a little bit more concentrated, or can I be even more still with it? And I've learned that if I, at some point with my breathing, if I really stay present for the exhale all the way to the very end of the exhale, that I get stiller, get quieter. And so I have this thought, Gil, I wonder if this is the time to do that long exhale thing and really stay there. Those are thoughts. For some people, those kinds of thoughts might be so subtle that they don't really feel like thoughts. They're more like knowing. Oh, kind of quiet knowing. But it is kind of a cognitive use, some kind of use of cognition, a kind of use of thinking. And so it gets quieter and quieter. At some point, the thought might occur to you, maybe I don't need to think anymore. And thoughts go away. And you just get really quiet, or seemingly very quiet. One of the real pleasures of meditation, there's many pleasures, but one of the pleasures is to have so little investment, so little energy going into our thinking, so little interest in our thinking, that a thought arises or passes by, and it's just kind of it's like gauze, or like a very thin veil, or just the imagery that's used in Buddhism is like a cloud in an empty sky, like a little cloud. It has no more substance, weight than a cloud. And it's, as opposed to some of these thoughts are the heaviest things you can ever carry. We talk about, carrying a burden. We have a burden. And where's that burden live? It's probably lives very much in the thoughts we carry. The thoughts is what gives weight to these big problems we have. How we relate to the thoughts. So the great pleasure, just having thoughts drift by, and to realize you're not relating to it, you're not identifying with it. It's just like soft thought. And that can be very educational, because as you start questioning not just what we think, but what thinking is. What is thinking? Very few people ever ask themselves that. People just think, and they think what they think is important, and the important thing is to think what you're thinking, not to question what you're thinking, or to look at the process of thinking, or to question the authority of our thoughts, to question how much we invest in our thoughts, and to have the thought, I wonder what it's like. What is it in between my thoughts? What's it like to be alive and present and aware in between thoughts? If you have it in between. Some people, thoughts are just a mile a minute, right? And just kind of like one after the other, continuous. But as they quiet down in meditation, there starts to be gaps. Maybe not long gaps, but what is in that gap? What's that like to be alive? Who am I when I don't use a thought to answer the question? That's a wonderful question. Who are you when you don't use thoughts to answer the question? Another interesting thought is, how much space is there outside of your thinking? Is your thinking localized, or does your thinking fill the universe? And if it doesn't fill the universe, how much space is there beyond it? And then that kind of can turn the mind a little bit. What? I mean, there's more going on in this universe than my thinking? What is that more? And so we, in our psychophysical being, we're much more than thoughts. And what is that more? And I'll end with another analogy that I'm fond of. The idea. And that is that the idea is that we can divide, it's possible to divide to some degree, the mind and the body. And in that division, thinking belongs more to the mind than to the body. And the intellect seems to be more of a mental thing, a mind thing. And you have intelligence, the intellect works in all kinds of ways. And we have images and thoughts and words that we tell ourselves and figure things out and do planning and all these things. And we process our lives. We try to process our lives through our thinking, sometimes unsuccessfully. The body has intelligence as well. The body understands things as well. The body can process our lives, sometimes better than our mind can. Our body is intelligent. However, the body doesn't speak. The body is silent. The body doesn't have the words or the images that the mind creates. So we tend to, our attention tends to go to the place where it's loudest. And the mind is the loudest. How about starting to give more attention to that which it that can't speak, but is just as intelligent, has just as much to teach you as the mind? What about thinking, having the thought? Let's discover, let's pay attention, let's listen to that in me which is not thinking, and see what it has to say, see what it has, what's there. And that's a way to support you to become quieter, because maybe you have to let the mind become quiet in order to listen to the quiet of the body. Maybe your body is not the library that you let the mind become quiet for, so it can listen. Or maybe the body is a temple that we contemplate with a quiet mind. The word contemplate comes from the word temple. Templus in Latin. So enter your temple of your body with the quiet mind, a still mind. And if you're thinking in your temple, think quietly and reverently, lovingly, caringly. So as you listen and sense and feel what is not your thinking, as you think about that, contemplate it. Think about it in sacred ways. May you enter the temple of your heart. So thank you. And so we're going to have the tea in a few minutes. And what I'd like to ask you, if you'd be willing, is to turn to one or two people next to you and say hello and introduce yourself. And if there was one idea, hopefully one idea from this talk that somehow interested you, or you found kind of interesting or perplexing or useful, why don't you